And how's it going? And welcome to the Roll for Stats podcast, episode 5. Today you are joined by co-host me, No Fun Allowed, and joined by co-host Dark Technomancer.
Hello.
Today we'll be talking about role-playing games, life, and whatever the frick else comes up. And of course, most important of all, we are going to be rolling up a character. Today's character, we are going to be rolling 2d9 down the line.
Oh boy. I'm excited.
I've never heard of anybody using this algorithm before. Are you ready?
It's probably gonna be terrible. Yeah. Roll 2d9.
11 strength.
11?
Strength, not bad.
Oh,
seven decks, you know.
Okay.
11
Another
con.
11. Good.
10.
Average.
11.
11.
10. We have.
These are some very average stats.
You are the most average person in every regard except for your dexterity. Your dexterity is below the line. Wow.
It's just, 0, 0, negative 2, 0, 0, 0, 0.
What? So this person is not natively an adventurer. This person natively, on paper, is a commoner.
Just a guy. Just a dude.
Wow. Wow. So what the frick do we transform this character into is what I'm wondering. Like,
well, I mean, being average means that you have the advantage of not being bad at anything, except for dexterity. So, rogue is out.
yes, absolutely.
But other than that, sky's the limit. I can do whatever I want. Except for a multi-class.
Multi-classing is out of your limit. So, let me go ahead and give you your character sheet here, because I accidentally wrote over the other one. But it's okay. We can still do shit. So, yeah, your character here is not that pleasant, all things considered. Your character is just like boring, like. But the thing is I've come to find when creating characters is you do not need to have stats in order to contribute to the party.
No, of course not. No. It is at its core, it's a role-playing game, right? And as long as you can play a role, it doesn't really matter how well you can do it. In fact, sometimes having the incompetent characters, the ones who kind of suck at everything, they drive the story even more because their failures set up more role-playing opportunities for everyone else.
Absolutely. I think that at the end of the day, specifically if you are rolling for stats, you are going to get gods and you are going to get clods. And yeah. I think what really it comes down to is if you have a good character, you get the 18s, the 16s, you get no negative stats at all. You start off as a Hercules. I think that's boring if that person goes on to become a legend. I think it's way more impressive if this Joe Schmo nobody goes on to become a hero.
Yeah. It's not always fun to be the Claude, though.
No.
It depends on the player, ultimately. There are some people who can take a junk character and just fucking roll with it. But there are definitely some who will, they'll be feeling a little salty about being behind everyone else.
Absolutely. So, yeah, well, I'm trying to remember, because, fun fact for all my listeners here, Techno is my first DM ever.
Yeah.
And
it's a great honor.
I have referenced you many a time, but never by name. I've always said my DM this, my DM that. Oh, yeah. And my very first character ever, looking back on it, I did spec incorrectly. But I think...
Oh, yeah. Brago was terrible.
My character was terrible. I had a -2 charisma and a -2 intelligence. And then, even though I was a dex-based fighter, I, for some reason, pumped my strength up a ton. And so I had a bunch of stats that, I felt like I probably should have needed. And then once I started playing more, I realized, man, I like role-playing a lot more than just combat. But,
well, yeah. And I mean, it's almost a perfect example of what I was saying before, right? With Brago... if you only looked at the combats that we did in Out of the Abyss, Brago didn't do shit. Right? He never contributed a damn thing to any
He
fight.
tried, okay?
He was useless. But when we think about like the things that we did in that campaign and the memories that we made, front and center every time, Brago is always involved. You always made sure that Brago was important to the campaign, even if the actual mechanics of the fight, he, take him or leave him.
For reference, it was a party of, well, it started off with 5, but quickly became 4. But there was a ranger that used a bow, there was a cleric that casted spells, and then there was a wizard that casted spells. So it'd always be Brago, the one up in the front. Brago, the one that's the tank. Brago, the one that swings his sword around like an idiot. And that, of course, led to me getting jacked up the most. It led to me getting into the most BS situations. And, during combat, that certainly led to my character, of course, not shining because all the other spellcasters, they could do, fireballs and, freaking the cleric, of course, can call down thunder and whatever. The most classic.
Yeah, and you were consistently outdamaged by the ranger.
The ranger was just, shooting the bows. But for sure, when it came to the role play, even though my character, I tried playing my character as unintelligent and as charismatic as he was, and I thought that was a blast.
Yeah, it was a good time. It was one of my favorite campaigns that I've ever run. Was definitely
absolutely
that Out of the Abyss with you and our other friends, Source 2 Self and that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, there's a ton of great stories that came out of that module, and I know I'm going to cover a lot of them on my channel. There's a lot of just, classic lines and classic situations that came out of that. But something that didn't really come out of that module was death, and specifically player character death. Well,
that's not true at all.
while yes, there was a player character in the beginning that dropped early, and on no fault of his own, Brago was the somewhat cause of his demise. Player character death didn't come up too much, but there was certainly a decent amount of NPC death.
That was more us writing character out of the campaign because the player dropped than it was a legitimate PC death.
But of course, you've DM'd a game or two, maybe 1 or 2, or how many, 17, 20 at this point, who knows?
I've DM'd my fair share for sure,
and I've DM'd my fair share as well. And I know
you've probably done more than I have now.
Maybe I did go on a spree for a bit, but something in particular is I sadly have become known as a deadly DM. I don't want that to be the case, but I've killed my fair share of PCs, so I was wondering, how do you go about killing PCs?
I am what you might call a very soft DM.
Candy DM.
I especially early on, my particular style of DMing definitely is about trying to make the characters feel powerful and heroic, right? Like D&D ultimately is sort of like an escape from reality, and exploring that fantasy of like, what if I had magical powers? What if I could like chop a dude in half with one swing? And I try to play into that as much as possible. And if the mechanics get in the way, then I just kind of quietly sweep them aside. But you also probably know me as a bit of a power gamer and a rules lawyer at the same time, and it's hard to reconcile those. But ultimately, what it comes down to is I will try to make sure there's always an option, right? If a player death is going to occur, I want there to be some kind of recourse for the players. It has to matter, right? It can't just be like, the kobold crits you, your head explodes, you're dead. It has to be dramatic if there's going to be a player death, because otherwise there's no point to it, right? It doesn't do anything except make a player feel bad. There has to be some kind of recourse. The players have to have something they can do, some kind of quest that they can go on to try and get their friend back. And I mean, that's essentially that's usually my approach to player death. If I've definitely had cases where, maybe it was like a level 1 party and they ran into an imp, and the imp got like a crit roll on them, and it would have killed them flat out. Just like, you're okay. You're a 1 HP, you know. But so, I can definitely appreciate a deadly DM. In the games that I've played with you, uh, no, I personally have never lost a character in one of your
Wow,
games.
you scumbag! You never did get oh, that's terrible.
But,
You had so many
okay,
people
well,
die around
okay.
you, and you got away. Oh my goodness.
Well, one exception, I did die in Tomb of Annihilations.
True.
Right at the end.
Yeah, that man, I can't believe you survived the frontier. That's amazing. Yeah. So unfortunately, yes, I have been known to be a killy DM, but that specifically, I talked about this a little bit before, but it really depends on the theme of the campaign. If the theme of the campaign is 4 epic badass heroes who go out to save the world, and it's all about their, congruent story and all the friends they make along the way, it sucks to kill a PC because then that player loses that connection with the world, and it really is hard to sit there and say, should I kill this person right here because of the mechanics, or should I kill them because of their decisions, or something along those lines. And that's definitely something I've had to struggle with in story games in particular is, should I air quote punish someone for a wrong move? A perfect example being, I'm running a game right now and my group blindly decided to walk into a spider's nest, and the spiders went and jumped the party and would have TPK'd them, but of course, I had some fun stuff where after they were all poisoned up, the spiders dragged them back in, and someone else came around and dragged them out of there. But you can only do that so many times. You can only have so many. Someone shows up at the last moment to save you because
You only have so many Deus Ex Machinas before the players realize that they have plot armor.
exact plot armor is terrible to have, because as soon as your players recognize that they have plot armor, they are going to do whatever they want, and they know that there's no recourse. Which is why I think that it is good that I've built up that reputation for being a deadly DM, because I would like to think that forces my players to make smarter decisions most of the time.
If your players are just criminally stupid, then
Well,
or let them die if they're gonna do really stupid shit.
you're gonna learn today, and that's all I gotta say. You're gonna learn today. you know, that's something that specifically with fifth edition as well. I think that there is this strange curve of fifth edition purposely. If you compare fifth edition to first edition, you see this curve of players having more options to get out of jail. You have your players that if they go down to 0 HP, they go to death saving throws, and statistically, it's more likely you're going to succeed on those death saving throws.
Right,
Versus
yeah.
if you go all the way back to first edition, your character sheet was a 3x5 note card with a name, some HP, and that was it. And if you dropped to 0 HP, you died. So it is interesting to see the lethality of D&D eventually air quote get easier and easier over time, but even still, of course, as you mentioned, you're just one imp getting a crit at level 1 away from dying. And I wonder how much we think about the mechanics of specifically 5th edition or just whatever game we're running in regards of lethality. Do you think that with 5th edition in particular, do you think that more people have just steered away from lethality?
I don't know about that. I think it really varies a lot from DM to DM. There are good soft DMs and there are good hardcore DMs, and there are bad examples of both of those as well. I think just because of the nature of it, um, uh, hardcore deadly DMs tend to end up being more often the examples that people go to for bad DMs. Uh, and I think part of that is just the nature of the experience, and there's also a difference between a deadly DM and a strictly adversarial DM.
Oh yes.
So speaking from experience when I've been a player in campaigns that you've been DMing, certainly there was always that danger of death present, but it never felt like you were actively trying to get us killed, right? You were simply presenting us with scenarios, and whether we got killed or not was up to us. And I think that's kind of an important aspect, right? Just because you present a deadly scenario doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to get the players killed. You're simply keeping that option on the table. For some GMs, I think they do play that sort of adversarial game. They're playing as if it's them versus the players.
You lose, I win.
Exactly, and I think that DM's not the right kind of game for that, right? Like
No, not at all.
There are asymmetrical board games all over the place you can play that are like everyone versus one person. And I think those are better suited to that kind of play style than something like D&D, because ultimately the GM has all the power. Like, if you want the players dead, they're dead. There's nothing stopping you from killing them.
The easiest thing you can do in D&D is kill the players. That's the easiest thing you can do. The hardest thing to do as a DM is actually present a challenge.
Yes. Creating a fair challenge where there's a real risk of death, but it's actually, fair. It's a very difficult balancing act, for sure. And I know we've had some discussions about some of your encounters in the frontier.
The classic one. 4
the
T-Rexes.
Legendary TPK orcs.
TPK orcs, 4 T-Rexes.
Ninja T-Rexes. But I think the most interesting out of those was the encounter with the Grix.
Oh, yes.
And that was unusual because it was a field encounter and it was just like 29 Grix out of nowhere.
They burned out of the ground, okay?
With some alphas mixed in there. But it was a really interesting encounter because while we were overwhelmed by numbers, they were relatively weak enemies for the level of players that we had and the number, right? It was a full party of six people.
Mm-hmm.
With an average level, I think around 6, wasn't it?
Probably, yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, one player did die in that encounter. But when we were looking at it, like, in terms of, say, challenge rating for the party that we had, it was absurdly high.
Oh, yeah.
It was insanely deadly. But only one person died, and that was despite the fact that we had some people making like really strategically poor decisions. we had like the main tank trying to run away at the start of the battle.
Yep.
We had like no good AoEs to deal with the swarms of enemies, but we did get through it, and I thought that was a really interesting encounter because ultimately it was a challenging but fair encounter, and probably Slippy wouldn't have died if we had played it a little more optimally, if we'd gone in knowing that we could win, but we were intimidated, and I think that is part of what made it such a good encounter, is the fact that we had a little bit of that realism, right, where we were a little uneasy going in. We didn't know whether we were going to be able to get out or not, whether we'd be able to escape if we fully engaged, or how bad things would end up. But it was a surmountable challenge.
Absolutely. I dig that aspect of you know, a lot of time you are separated from your character, of course. You sit down and you look at the encounter, and then you have to reconcile, okay, I think that we could do this, but what would my character think? And I love when those two align. I love when you sit there and you're like, okay, both me and my character both think we're screwed. So what do we do here? And I think that really adds to the role playing element of the game. In particular, like a combat with some monsters that typically isn't role play heavy. But when you consider the interparty dynamics of working with each other, whether that is player to player or character to character, there was a lot of dynamicism to that specific encounter. And I really dig that whole not playing optimally. Every once in a while, you are going to sit there and you're not going to be able to measure up the fireball correctly. You're not going to be able to, make the move to the right square that you want to. And I think that's fine. I think that if you, depending on the encounter that is rolled up, that will certainly be okay, because more often than not in 5th edition, you typically try and have encounters that are air quote fair. But a lot of times, of course, the DM, takes their foot off the gas a little bit, or they just go ahead and let it roll and see what happens. And with that one in particular, I want to say that I didn't take the, in fact, I hit the gas pedal on that one. I tried killing everybody, but, obviously every once in a while that just doesn't happen. And sometimes the stars align and you guys are able to work together and get it done.
Yeah, for sure. It's really hard early on, right? At low levels, balancing encounters is the hardest,
right?
Yeah. Because everyone is like one critical away from death at all times. And it definitely makes things difficult. You might recall in Out of the Abyss, in the very first die roll of the entire game,
yes.
in combat, was the cleric getting critically hit by a drow and just getting dropped to 0 HP immediately. And that's always a risk in low level combat encounters. And I think the only reason I let that proceed as is was because I knew that it was supposed to be a sort of like intense panicky moment where there's I know we discussed no module spoilers. This is literally the very beginning of the module. There's attacking, and your drow captors are against you, but also the are against you, but also they're against each other, so it's chaos all over the place, and you guys are just trying to get out of there. And so I think like having a party member drop in the middle of that chaos was sufficiently dramatic and did add to the experience.
Oh, for sure.
And in the end, you guys managed to like drag him out of there. You survived.
I recall once again, being the muscle of the party, I had to do all the freaking legwork. But yeah, definitely early level stuff is tough. And speaking of early level stuff here, we have your character here, and I've got it labeled as Techno. So let's go ahead and plug in those stats, and let's think about, when I say let's, of course, I'm thinking, what do you want to transform this character into? What are you going to do with these stats?
What indeed? Well, as I discussed earlier, I can pretty much do whatever I want. Because this guy...
Because you're equally bad at everything.
Equally bad at everything.
Man. It is so excellent seeing all those zeros, and then you just sadly see that one dark spot of -2. Oh, so sad.
So with the low strength, heavy armor is kind of out of the question. So you don't really want to be a paladin or a fighter either.
Yes. So,
but with the low dexterity, medium armor is not very good either.
Correct. I'm pretty sure. I think I smells a caster in this character. So, we want a caster, but we want a caster that can wear heavy armor. Even if I'm stuck with just chainmail, that's better than just dying.
So I think we're looking for a utility caster that can wear heavy armor, and that leads me to life cleric. I think is what I would go with.
Classic. Because, healing is certainly a thing where, of course, it is nice to have higher stats, but you don't need, the +3, the +4 to healing. Healing is healing at the end of the day. But at least I've discussed on this channel before, in combat, you definitely want to hit people before you heal people. But
healing's terrible in 5th edition.
healing sucks.
No question.
Healing, it is far superior to kill whatever is hurting you than try and out DPS it, or not out DPS it, but out heal the DPS.
The one exception to that, and I imagine you've discussed it before because I know you have some pretty strong feelings about it, is playing whack-a-mole.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, if someone goes down, you just hit them with a little heal to get them back up again.
Yes, so natively...
That's the best application of combat.
Yep, natively, rules as written. Good old, drop down to 0 HP, healing word, they stand right back up. Asimar's little healing touch, stand right up. 1 point of lay on hands from the paladin, stand right back up. Obviously, in my homebrewed rules, I have gotten rid of that because that will kill you at some point.
Mm-hmm, yeah,
but
I believe you just it's a point of exhaustion each time.
Yep,
you get magically revived that way.
Yep, and I find that's fair because once again, the whole whack-a-mole aspect is just, I think it's boring in a sense. But another thing,
it certainly can be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that like, if you're trying to show off this like epic combat with, the big bad boss of the campaign, and then you just have this comical moment on the side where someone stands up, knock back down, stands up, knock back down, like that kind of draws away from what I think a cool combat would be.
Yeah, no, it's true. And it feels a little awkward as well, right? Because one of the weirdest abstractions in D&D is definitely initiative order. Mm-hmm. And when you end up in that whack-a-mole scenario, suddenly the order that people are going in becomes extremely important.
Oh yes.
Because if you revive someone, you want to make sure that they're going to have a turn before they just get slapped back down again. And so you can end up in a scenario where someone gets knocked down and the healer's like, well, I'm not going to bother with that because it goes me, then the enemy, and then him. So all that's going to happen is we're going to get stuck in a loop of I pick him up, the enemy knocks him down, he does a saving throw, and then I pick him up again.
But mind you could have those interesting scenarios where you say, okay, I'm going to risk it all. I'm going to hold my action to cast this spell after their turn. But then, so you could have those, dynamic moments. Holding actions is definitely interesting in D&D. It certainly can be very powerful, but more often than not, you don't see it. And of course, depending on the wording of the DM and the player, it can be very finicky. But I think it's a necessary evil because I think the only other way you could really do holding initiative or holding your action is by using a Greyhawk system where you declare what you're going to do beforehand, but no one likes the Greyhawk initiative system except for me.
It bogs things down a lot.
It bogs it down significantly.
Slows the game down.
If there was just a way you could, for those of you that don't know, Greyhawk initiative system is you declare what you're going to do and then you roll your initiative dice, but you're not rolling a d20, mind you. Your initiative is tied to what you want to do. So, for example, being instead on your turn, you say, okay, I'm going to just stab the person that's in front of me. You simply roll a d6. But if you say, I want to move and then stab somebody, then you would roll a d6 plus a d8. If you want to simply shoot a bow, then you roll a d4. And I think it's a really cool table of you can clearly see what would be coming first. And typically, I think the one initiative system I saw was casting spells is usually later on. Like usually, if you cast a spell, you're rolling a d12. So
One place where that sort of uh, modified initiative system where people declare their actions can work really well, though, is play-by-post games.
yes,
Um, I'm most experienced with, obviously live in-person role-playing games and on Roll20. Uh, but in a more slow format play-by-post on, say, a forum or a Discord channel, something like that, uh, it actually can go much faster if you have everyone just say what they're going to do, regardless of what the initiative order is. And that opens up a lot more options for you to have more dynamic initiative systems.
for sure. Those play-by-post, I think it's becoming a lot more popular now, especially because everyone's locked inside their houses all day. But
Sure.
I certainly appreciate play-by-post. I know not everyone does. I know a lot of people want that, interactivity, whether they be at the table or just at least in voice chat. But you can't have everything you want. And I think the beauty of play-by-post in particular is the fact that if you take a look at what you do in D&D, you sit there for anywhere between 2 to 4 hours, typically once a week. But the thing is, if you do play by post, you could theoretically get more hours in the game throughout the course of the week than you would have if you had played in person.
You could,
Because
theoretically, though getting people to stay consistent has been.
yeah, that's the problem, right? Is getting people to be consistent. You gotta find that right special group. You gotta find those people that are dedicated to it. But
You tend to end up with play-by-post having like 2 or 3 players who are like really into it and like constantly posting, and they just tend to like take the game like away from everybody else, and then those other people start to feel a little left out, and they're not as engaged and kind of end up dropping.
we kind of alluded to this in the beginning, and once again, not to point me out as the bad guy here, but I have indeed noticed that I am a spotlight hog. I can easily admit to that. But in regards of being a spotlight hog, I don't try and do it for the sake of about me. I usually try to do it for the sake of trying to drag people along with me in the spotlight or trying to move the plot along. Do you have so what are your thoughts on, spotlight hogs or, glory hogs or whatever the case may be?
I think much like with the DMs, there are good and bad versions of all types of players. So certainly you can have a good active player, someone who brings it out of other players, right? They encourage the other players to come out of their shells and do interesting things. But then at other times you'll have players that really that are bad. I have a story of a person. I don't think it would be fair to say their name, even though nobody would obviously have any reference to who I'm talking about. So for the sake of conversation, we'll just call this person Steve.
Okay.
Now, Steve was a bit of a man-child. And this, to give a little bit of context, I knew this guy when I was like 15. Okay. Now, he played D&D in a group with my parents, and I was briefly involved in that game as well. I am a born and bred nerd. Okay? I played D&D with my parents when I was a kid, and it was awesome. Okay, my mom was a fantastic DM. So the problem was that this Steve fellow didn't seem to understand that there were other players in the game. And so when he made his character, he basically wanted to be like Aragorn. He wanted to be like the main character, the chosen one type deal. And the other players were all experienced role players, and they didn't really buy into it that much. And he would get really, really upset when the spotlight didn't stay on him. So he would often try to initiate infighting with party members. He would he would be quick to just say, "I'm doing this," with no discussion with the other players, which can be a good thing. That sort of spontaneity driving things forward if players get bogged down. But it was always about like, "Oh, I'm going to solve this problem because I can do anything." Right? He was really playing up that power fantasy, but at the expense of everyone else. And that it kind of came to a head at one point when he was, in character. They were having this big argument, and he decided that it was his way or the highway. Everyone was going to do what he wanted them to do, or he was just. I don't know what his ultimatum was supposed to be. This was a long time ago, but ultimately the wizard decided, fine, hit him with a force cage, and then they were like, "You just stay in gay baby jail, and we will, resolve this like people." And they just left him there for the rest of the session. He was just stuck, and he got really upset, and he quit the campaign. He was super whiny, and the Dan, the person who had invited him to the game, was like apologizing profusely. So there definitely can be some horror stories with Spotlight Hogs, but at the same time, you need someone to actually do those things, because a lot of D&D players, let's face it, we tend to be maybe a little more often on the introverted side.
What?
Not the most socially skilled demographic. So, it really helps to have that one person who can like get people engaged and get people moving. What my favorite type of player as a DM is the player who will just like do spontaneous, insane, like off the rails stuff. Just to try it, right? They don't look at what's written on their character sheet and then determine the most optimal choice for them at any time. They go, "I want to do this. Let's find out if I can." And I mean, that's my favorite kind of player. And those players are never afraid of failing. Any player who plays
be.
like that, they're absolutely ready for their crazy plans to just completely fall apart. Which is great, because they usually do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You like success should not be the go-to, right? Like failure is fun. Not that whole not knowing what's ahead of us. That's the whole reason why we play a lot of these games, is because we are venturing out into the unknown. We are going up against the crazy and the kooky and the wild, and of course, every once in a while, you sit there and you go, "Okay, I throw the dynamite at in the cave." It's like, okay, and there's a cave collapse. Like you can have just amazing, fun little stories and times just by one person acting crazy for a brief moment. And I definitely appreciate those characters that drive along the narrative and the story and all that. But at the same time, it's also good to recognize the fact that, of course, every once in a while you do have the Harry Potter players. You have the people that sit around and wait for adventure to come to them, or they wait to get dragged along because they're, they're not, they themselves are not adventurers, even though your tagline for being in a D&D game is being an adventurer, but whatever.
I actually have an interesting story about a sort of, I guess we'll say alignment neutral. I'll let you be the judge.
Okay.
For a Spotlight Hoggish player, where it was well, I'll just tell the story and let you be the judge. So I was DMing a homebrew campaign that took place in the Planescape setting. This is actually the same game that I played with a few people from your community briefly before some real life stuff got in the way. But with a different group. So at the beginning of the campaign, the players, most of the players, okay, all but one of them, got sort of scammed into an ambush. They were in an unfamiliar place. They didn't know anything, and they were taken advantage of, and they had all their stuff stolen. So that was the very, very beginning, right? They got ambushed, they got beaten up, and the bad guys made off with all their equipment. Now, the last player who didn't get involved with that had followed them, and so they saw all that happening. And so instead of going with the party, they followed the bad guys.
Oh, yes.
So we had this situation where the party went to one place and got introduced to the plot, and they were firmly on the rails, and then one player who had gone completely off of them. And so this rogue player waited until nightfall. They had followed the bad guys, so they knew where they were, knew where the stuff was, and they also knew that in an unfamiliar place, it was probably a good idea to get some allies on their side. So they decided, fuck it, I'm a rogue. I'm going to steal their stuff back. And so they used a combination of, charisma rolls and thieves' cant and whatnot. They tracked down the fence that was selling the stuff to like the night market in town. And all of this I had to improvise because, again, they were completely off the rails. And so what they did is they found the specific fence, and they like created a distraction and just like stole all of his stuff and just booked it out of there. But they rolled incredibly well for everything. And their plan was fairly solid, right? They scouted it out ahead of time. They knew who they were dealing with. They had like names that they could drop to make their story sound credible. And so they ended up kind of like soloing the entire first leg of the campaign, which was like dealing with these local thugs to try and get their stuff back, solo by themselves, and then just brought it back and was like, "Hey guys, I found your stuff. By the way, I'm Cuba. Nice to meet you." And like that was a great intro to the campaign, even though I ended up having to throw away, several pages of material. And unfortunately, it excluded the other party members who were just kind of stuck watching with awe as this person soloed the whole thing. But it was a good experience for me, and the other players did enjoy like watching it all unfold. But I could definitely imagine with a different group of people, the players who were excluded just feeling bored and excluded.
For sure. That's definitely something difficult because you want to shed the spotlight on everyone at some point. You want them to have their moment of glory. But at the same time, we are playing a group game, and, at that particular table, I believe you had 6 people, right? So it does get tough to split that all around. You obviously do need to reward those people for doing awesome stuff and playing to their character, especially if their character's good. If their character's bad, then you should not, focus on that. But it made sense specifically for a rogue to be, a thief. If you had someone that was like, I don't know, like a paladin that was just trying to do the exact same thing, it probably would have shooken up differently, as it should have been. But it made sense for, if someone's stuff got stolen, that it gets stolen right back. It makes sense. that is a really tough thing to do in a larger group. And I think that is something I want to talk about is number of players in a game. You know, I've run anywhere between one-on-ones. I do love me some one-on-ones. I've run 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and unfortunately, my biggest gaming table I've ever had was 11. I'm never doing that again.
So
But
I don't envy you.
golly, that was a nightmare.
I had an in-person game with a DM and 8 players once, and that was in person. Everyone's sitting around a table,
mm,
and it was a mess.
oh yeah. I imagine in person it could be a little bit easier just for the sole purpose that you could literally whisper to people and have tiny little sidebars while things are going on. But if you're doing this
Yeah,
online,
it's a little bit easier with communication,
yeah.
because obviously in an online room, everybody hears everybody else at full volume at all times.
Yeah, so
Whereas
at best you could just type on the side, which sucks.
in a real room, you have proximity and body language, things that you can kind of use to make communication a little bit simpler. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to describe unless you've been in both scenarios. Being in a group of 6 people all talking at the same time, and being in a group call of 6 people all talking at the same time, like it's a world of difference.
Oh yes. So these D&D games or just any role playing game in general, they typically do have somewhere like slated down, whether that be on the module itself or on the just the gaming system itself. It'll say recommended 3 to 5 players, 4 to 6 players, whatever. But of course, in today's day and age, the tried and true number is 4. 4 players, 1 DM. That's just the go-to classic. Do you
I think that's definitely a good sweet spot.
Yeah.
I personally don't feel comfortable going above six players plus the GM, and having fewer than 3 players is generally not worth the effort to me, as a DM. But that's my own personal preference. I think there's definitely value to be had in one-on-one games. I think you could definitely have an interesting experience with two players and a DM. But those are completely different dynamics, I think, compared to the 3 and up campaigns. Having 3 players interacting with each other is just automatically completely different than the more intimate setting of 2 or even just 1 with the GM.
For sure. I like I said, I've run, all these variable, sizes, and what I've come to find is with one-on-ones, you get to truly see people grow, or at least you get to see who they truly are. You, of course, can get those people that typically do rely on other people's input, and then when they're by themselves, it is interesting to see how they operate, whether they finally step up or they just do whatever it is that they're doing, which is perfectly fine. You can be a shy player, you can be a backseat player. That's perfectly fine. But it is nice to see how they truly react, and if it is because they react one way when they're by themselves, and then another way if they're in a group, and then eventually you scale that all up the way to 4 or 5 players. You can definitely see who's taking charge, who does what. The player dynamics in amongst themselves. And I think, some of the most fine moments for me as a DM is when I show my players a location, or, I tell them they go somewhere, they do this, they do that. But then they just sit there and they talk amongst themselves, and they allow me to have a breather because they get to role play in amongst themselves.
Oh, that's the best. As a DM, the absolute best experience you can ever have is when the players just start like role playing, and like for an hour you just sit back and watch them go.
Absolutely. Because all the time, of course, players try and get to, talk to the NPCs, and they try to get you to do funny voices, or they bully the NPC, or they do whatever. And all the time, you have to come up with some stuff on the spot. And all the time, they ask you the name of that one NPC you never thought would have a name, and you sit there and look dumb.
Come up with a name.
Ugh. I hate every player that ever asks for an NPC's name ever. They know the answer. They know we don't know.
Hey Claire, what's the name of that drow that was scoping you out?
Oh, Zalith?
In the middle of the market.
Zalith?
Because I had to come up with that.
Yeah, you did. my drow girlfriend. Yeah, I totally remember. She was great.
Zalith Bainray.
Absolutely,
completely out of nowhere. Just had to pull that character out of my ass.
See, like, exactly, right? Like, I was a scumbag player back then. I didn't know any better. I thought, yeah, I literally just talked about this, but I could have sworn when you were running this game, I could have sworn that you were running it up by the book, and then, it was just flowing beautifully, and everything was perfectly in place for you. It was just a puzzle that you were just waiting to pick up and put down. But then, of course, I finally talked to you about it, and I opened up the book and whatever.
If you've ever read Out of the Abyss, that's not Out of the Abyss. You can't run Out of the Abyss that way.
No, I was perplexed by this. Of course, I was like, "What the frick? How did you do this? How did you string this quest along? How did you introduce these NPCs? How the frick did you run that stupid mine? Like, I can't remember the name of the mine off the top of my head, but you know the one I'm talking about."
The Whirlstone Caverns?
The Whirlstone Caverns, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no spoilers there, but that is a nightmare to read. The map is terrible. Golly. Just a whole bunch of terrible stuff. I will say, without any spoilers of Out of the Abyss, there is a part where you can literally go from one little area to another area, and you got to flip like 20, 30 pages. Like,
yeah.
what the frick?
Yeah, it was not a very well organized book.
I am glad that they, in the early modules of 5th edition in particular, they were trying to get a feel for what they wanted in regards to the art style, in regards of the pacing, in regards of the storytelling. You can definitely tell that with the Dragon Queen, duo there. The fact that there was 2 modules interlinked with each other, I'm glad that they stopped doing that, because I think that would be a terrible precedent. They did Out of the Abyss, and the structuring for that one was not so great, and I'm glad that they learned from that.
Well, Out of the Abyss was very ambitious too, right? Because it's like level. Technically it's up to, I think, 15,
mm-hmm.
but it's effectively a level 1 through 20 campaign all the way.
Yeah.
And that's insane for one book.
Yeah, absolutely. It is crazy to think how much they put into that, But yeah, just the fact that we as DMs have to sit here and we've got to think about okay, they're about to do this quest. Okay, they've interacted with this NPC and this NPC. What is this NPC doing? Off screen, and then of course you have the players that just go ahead and muck it all up, and that is of course that's what we thrive for. That's what we want. We want to challenge ourselves as DMs, and
it's always funny to me as a DM when the players are like, "Oh, well, we've been talking for a while. We don't want to like slow down your game." And I'm like, "No, keep going."
No, yeah, I absolutely like. In fact, every once in a while, if they are talking to each other and it sounds like they're about to like try and press forward, I'd have like some NPC around to try and start up the conversation, and then immediately back out so that they get talking again. I love those moments. I truly appreciate when my players sit down and really discuss the things about the world, whether that be the politics or the religions or just the interpersonal connections of all that they've made along the way. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And going back into the whole number of players in the game thing, I think that if you have 8 players in a game, you probably don't get that often. Sad to say, I know, but most tables are not Critical Role, where you have, a whole bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors who sit around and play Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, I think you definitely tend to have a higher ratio of people phoning it in with the larger player counts.
Yeah, and it does suck because, you know, if you have like 8 people that are all incredibly, you know, nice, they all probably are going to sit down and be like, oh, I don't want to hog the spotlight. Oh, I don't want to hog the spotlight. And then you get 8 people running around here saying, oh, I don't want to like take too much time. I don't want to take too much time. And then that does suck because if you are trying to run one of those games where you know the relationships you've built along the way are all that you want, it's sort of hard to get.
I think one important factor, if you're going to run one of those larger games, is you just have to accept that some people are going to just phone it in, and that's fine. Let them. Some people are going to get bored and not want to continue, and that's fine. Let them. Because with a huge game like that, you can't please everybody. So all you can do is just run the game to the best of your ability, and if people aren't enjoying it, don't force them to stay. Just, but don't necessarily kick them out, but make it clear that the game is what it is, and you know there's nothing you can do to change that.
For sure, you know, you do have to sit down as a DM and consider what is best for the majority. You can have, if you've got, you know, 6 players, you can have 5 players that are super duper heavy role play, and then you got that one player who sits there and says, "Oh, I just want to combat." And if they sit there and, you know, just bake in, you know, the role play, that's fine. But if they go out of their way to subvert, you know, what everyone else wants, for example, being if there's heavy role play, and then that one player says, I charge in, you know.
Yeah, sure.
You can get those players that take away from the majority, and
yeah, and that's a different situation. That's when you actually do have to step in and,
yeah,
you know, actually address the problem. But if it's just someone who's kind of like staying quiet until combat happens, and then they're like, "Oh yeah, I cast magic missile." Like, if that's how they want to do it, they can do that. They are probably going to get bored and leave the game. But ultimately, if you have, you know, like 8 people in a game, you can't possibly be expected as a DM to give your full attention to every single one of those people, right?
no.
The players, it's up to the players to engage just as much as it is the DM.
Yeah, for sure. You know, it is like, you know, I feel like there's a lot of people who sit here and think that the DM needs to arbitrate everything. But that is when it's like the larger the group you have, you need a player that can rein in the players as well. You need that shot caller. You need the, you know, the picker upper.
I think it's kind of funny. The DM is always sort of the de facto group leader, like beyond the in-game mechanics, but in like in terms of organization, right? The DM is the de facto person who, you know, organizes when everyone's going to be able to show up and play the game. They're the person who has to arbitrate any disagreements between the players. And it's a bit weird that that they have all of this extra responsibility dumped on top of them, on top of, you know, basically running every aspect of the game that isn't a single player. One interesting thing that I have seen done only one time before is a group that had kind of a dedicated like group organizer who was not the GM.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the GM in that group, and it was amazing. It was fantastic not having to worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, we can only strive to have, you know, those 1 or 2 players that can show up in the party and, you know, help facilitate everything. I think something interesting is I was never that player right when I started because I was brand new to everything, but I definitely tried, you know, trying to get everyone involved, but you can only push people so far. You can bring a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? And at the end of the day, you do have to reconcile that with your players and with yourself, that not every player is meant for every group, and not every DM is meant for every player. It's just one of those things. You're going to have to shop around a bit until you find that magical group that you are going to be sticking around with.
Yeah. it can also be difficult if you're, say, in a Discord server with 50 people and you post up like, hey, who's interested in this campaign? And you get 20 responses and you're just like, oh my.
Oh.
Now what do I do?
Yeah, so that was before I started that YouTube channel too. So maybe I if I start doing stuff like that, maybe I'll get even more people showing up. And I definitely plan on doing more community-based stuff for sure. But I know for a fact that the next group game that I run, it is going to be a multi-DM process. It is not going to be a one-man band.
Co-DMing can actually be an excellent experience. I know in the Out of the Abyss, I had my brother join for a couple of games, and he co-DM'd with me, and that was a good experience for me. And I thought you guys enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, and once again, I did the scumbag player move of interacting with some NPCs, and you and your brother had to come in and totally improv at the last second.
Yeah,
it was great.
Yeah, and that was a good time. I mean, as you know, I had I kind of had a sort of extra villain in my back pocket that I'd been saving.
Oh yes.
And I was able to work it in, but how you ended up there, that was totally improv and just based on you like deciding, okay, I'm gonna go do this thing now, and I was just like, oh geez.
Once again, it fits so well with my character, but I think something that I've seen is a lot of people's first character is a personification of the player themselves.
Yeah, and I mean it's comfort. It's the comfort zone, right?
Yeah,
they play something that's similar to themselves,
and
because they know themselves.
Yeah, for my character in particular, my what I've imparted on Brago in particular was the wanderlust, because the best part about the first time I ever played D&D was that both me and the character were in line of not knowing what the heck was going on, and that was awesome.
Yeah, it was a good campaign for that, I think. For because it took place in the Underdark, the fact that you didn't know anything was kind of like par for the course. It was expected. There wasn't as much like, oh, you ought to already know that.
Yeah, I mean that was fantastic. Like it does suck that you can only get that once, the first time glance, right? But every time you can get a new character into the game and seeing the excitement that they have of, okay, you turn around a corner and you see this creature and you describe, it's a large bear, but it has the beak of an owl. And them seeing that creature for the first time is just so iconic and so amazing, and it's so great that over the course of however many years of D&D's been going on, we have all these DMs that are DMing for these players, and those players, DM, and so on and so forth. So if we take a look at like our air quote family tree here, I, of course, was imparted from you, and you were imparted from your mom, and et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. And it is cool to think about the history of role-playing games.
Yeah, but a bit of an oral tradition going on there.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of oral traditions, I have... Well, this has nothing to do with oral traditions, in fact. This is more along the lines of writing.
Sick segue.
Yes, totally, right there, right? So, something I've done for a few years now is I sit down, and whenever I get done with a session, I write it up. Mm-hmm. Because for me, this is a great way to remind myself of what's going on. And most important of all, it's a way to lord it over my players, so that way I can screw them over later. I mean, enrich the experience later, right?
Sure.
And I think about this all the time when I'm doing these write-ups is, when I'm doing those write-ups in particular, I usually do it from a third-person perspective of just writing about the experiences, but I, of course, don't write down everything. I don't write down every little detail. I might, write down in my own GM notes that, some little details that I don't want out there. But when I'm done with these write-ups, I post them up, and the players themselves could read it. But that gets me thinking as well is, should I allow my players to read these, or would I, something I think I should do, and maybe even force, is force my players to do their own write-ups of the session. I think that would be fantastic.
I think that's very group dependent. There are definitely some groups who get really, really engaged, and they just want to they want something to do, and for them, assigning them some kind of D&D homework, right? For them, that's great. But then other people, they just want to play the game, right? So one thing that I used to do as a DM, I used to ask for people to give me magic item wish lists.
Oh, yeah.
So just to give me ideas of what kind of items they would like to see and obtain for their characters. I stopped doing that because players just hated doing it. it was the extra work of trying to research the items.
And we have to do homework. What are we, DMs?
And then on top of that, if they got those items, they were just like, "Oh yeah, I read about that item when I went and made my wish list." Right? It kind of ruined the wonder and the surprise. Right? Like if you get given a hat of disguise out of a dragon's hoard, you're just like, "I got a hat that lets me shape change. That's fucking rad."
Yeah, it was. And I used that thing to absolutely no effect.
If you're like, "Oh, I looked it up and there's a hat that will let me change shapes, and I think that I can use that to improve the deceptive abilities of my character." It's not the same experience.
For sure, there is some gaming systems where the magic item table is actually located in the player's handbook, because it is expected that the players read through the player's handbook. They look at all the classes and races and whatever the frick else, and then they see those magical items, and that gets them wanting those magical items. And that is a thought process in game development of how do we tease whatever they can possibly get. Do we just have it where it's up to the DM's discretion, or do we have it there, or whatever? And that is interesting to think that, of course, you could have those players that sit there and say, "Oh, I see this +3 longsword. That looks awesome. I want it." Or, of course, you could have those players that say, "Oh, it's just a +3 longsword. Okay, I know what it is. I know what it does. That's that. End of story." Kind of, the wanderlust that we were talking about earlier that you obtain specifically when going into something blind is lost. I love grabbing a magical item and not knowing what it does, attuning to it, finding it out that I'm getting it cursed, but it gives me a cool, little bonus effect. That's way more fun than just reading it on paper.
Yeah, for sure. And I do like to try to make things a little bit more interesting. Maybe customize the magic items a little bit. Make little adjustments to how they work compared to just straight out of the book to keep players on their toes, so that they're not just going, "Oh yeah, it's one of those, got it."
Yeah, and I've certainly done that as well, and I think the easiest way to go ahead and shake it up for especially experienced people or people that just read up in the item list there is change the name. Change the image. It's not a +1 sword of vengeance. It's a it's a mysterious scimitar that shines a vibrant red. And just like that, your player doesn't know what the heck that thing is, and then they want to figure it out. And once they know the mechanic of it, they might sit there and know what it is. But once again, you can just do a tiny little adjustment of just a few little words changed, and bada bing, it's a brand new item, but you didn't have to do any work at all, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly think that specifically magical items, that is a huge draw of specifically D&D, and I know it is for a lot of role-playing fantasy games, but D&D in particular had, in its past, your character was built up on the magical items. There was no such thing as attunement slots. Back in the day, you'd have a whole bunch of rings, you'd have a whole bunch of cloaks, you'd have a whole bunch of weapons, and then you use whatever whenever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
But 5th edition now, of course, we do have the attunement system where the items are so incredibly powerful, so incredibly badass that you yourself cannot contain enough of them. You can only be attuned to 3 magical items that need attunement. What is your... Do you have any ideas about attunement? Do you have any thoughts on it?
I think that it makes things simpler. And I think that simpler isn't always necessarily a good thing. However, I do feel that the attunement system as a way of balancing out a character is nice, because you want your character to be to represent sort of the effort that you've put into creating it, rather than just what stuff you've picked up, in my opinion. Now, for some people, having their character defined by all the cool stuff they have is what they want, and so for them, maybe attunement isn't so great. But for me, I also enjoy the sort of the mechanical challenge of like, oh, I gotta pick like which items are good, which items do I want. But the biggest thing, the most important thing I think that attunement helps with is it instantly resolves so many arguments in inter-party about
I want that. No, I deserve it.
Because you can only equip so many, so like there's a lot less fighting over each item. Someone's like, I mean, I already got a +1 sword, I'm using my attunement on that, so maybe I can't be equipping all these different things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there is definitely that old trope of, that one person who has all the magical items in the party, and they, don't deign anything on anyone else. But now, specifically with 5th edition, you could theoretically still hoard all the magical items if you wanted to, I guess, but you wouldn't be able to do anything with it. You can only wear so many rings, you can only wear so many cloaks, you can only wield so many weapons.
And I played as a strength-based grappling character in Storm King's Thunder campaign, which you were briefly a part of before you got cut in half by a giant. And there were a lot of items that didn't require attunement, strangely enough. But of course, because the theme of the campaign was giants, a lot of them were like really big and heavy. And because my character was bizarrely optimized specifically for carrying capacity, I ended up with that character just like carrying around like this giant dragon tooth club and this huge divining rod sized for giants and all these other magical items that nobody else could even carry, and it was kind of interesting.
Yeah, the attunement idea is it's funny. You said a word which I can't believe you let slip from your mouth there. Balance in 5th edition, because as we all know, there is literally no game ever in the history of humankind that is 100% balanced. It's impossible.
True.
No game has ever been balanced,
except for maybe. I was going to say chess, but
chess is not balanced.
It's a very small one, but it's measurable. There is an advantage for the white player.
Specifically, so we think about D&D, and of course the role playing aspect of it is whatever. But at the end of the day, combat is turn based, and turn based games. Yeah, turn based in particular is definitely. It's not balanced, because if you're early on the draw, you have better balance, you have better semblance. If you have more numbers, it's better. But most important of all, what I'm referring to is the classes of 5th edition.
Right.
Because not all classes were created equal.
Right. There's there's a couple bad classes compared to the others. four elements monk.
Four
Four
elements
elements
monk.
monk
Ugh.
gets a lot of hate. The
You don't want to
original,
be a third level wizard by what, like eighth level, something like that.
you know, and there was an interesting argument that I got into with one person who was basically their contention was that um, spellcasters are just way stronger in fifth edition than any other type of class. Right? There's no reason to be a martial class because the spellcasters. That was their contention, and I was like, well, sort of. There's sort of three casts, I guess, in the system of D&D. You have your have-nots, the monk and the ranger, and to a lesser degree the rogue. And then you have your kind of like your reasonable classes, which are the fighter, paladin, all the spellcasters, and then you have warlocks.
Then you have warlocks.
And like, but if your contention is that there's no reason to play uh, anything other than the best thing, you would just always play warlock, right? It's D&D isn't a game about being optimal all the time. If it was, it would be solved because every single player in every single party would always play warlock. Every single time. There's no role in a party that cannot be occupied by a warlock. There just isn't. Warlocks can do everything better than everyone else. But luckily, Dungeons and Dragons is not a game about balance.
Thankfully.
It is a role-playing game. And the fact that warlocks are, on paper, stronger than anyone else, can, if the DM so chooses, be mitigated by some very role-play oriented limitations in the form of packed patrons, as well as stuff like social stigma, which doesn't come up a lot because I guess it doesn't feel very good to play a warlock and then be like, oh, well, I gotta be bogged down by all this stuff about like a patron harassing me or everyone hates me because I'm.
I sold my soul to a devil. Why do I have to bother with the devil?
But it's a role playing game, and that makes things more interesting, right? Like a paladin or a cleric has to think about their god or their oath and how they interact with those things. A wizard might have some kind of arcane research that drives them that maybe doesn't necessarily lend itself to a life of adventure, but got to pay the bills. There are all kinds of role play opportunities beyond just making your character as strong as possible. And so I don't think it's a bad thing that some classes are better or worse than others. I don't necessarily either think that it's a bad thing that Wizards is trying to take steps to address the fact that some classes are just better or worse than others. But it's not a bad thing for the game to be unbalanced.
Yeah, I mean, it allows people to shine in different ways, If you do want you want to be the Hexblade Warlock, Polearm Master, Sentinel, then you can be that, like, but you don't need to be that. You can do whatever the frick you want, and hopefully if you have a understanding DM, they will cater the game around the players.
And any DMs listening to this, okay? If you're going to take one thing away from this whole conversation, please listen to this little bite of wisdom. If you think that Polearm Master and Sentinel on a Warlock casting Darkness is overpowered and unfun and unfair, don't ban it. Create scenarios that make things more interesting, right? Have like a small corridor, or have some kind of magical light. Now, let me be clear. I am not advocating just completely countering all of their abilities through, DM Fiat. What I'm saying is lean into it. Obviously, the person playing that character is seeking combat challenges because they have tuned their character to such a degree. So give them combat challenges. Just instead of banning them from having their fun, try to find ways to engage that player, right? Obviously, they want to engage in difficult combat challenges. Just give them some. And the other players will have plenty of time to roleplay. And you know what? Maybe it'll become, a running joke on the table every time they cast darkness and the rest of the party is flailing around in the dark like, come on, you asshole, we can't see shit, what's happening? Like, it creates opportunity, and let the players play that. Maybe the rest of the party will tell them to stop casting darkness because they can't see anything. Or maybe they'll come up with strategies involving, using him as like a vanguard while they, attack with ranged weapons from the distance. Like, it's okay for the characters to do something that's overpowered. Them being stronger than other players, no one's really going to mind that too much. I think the worst thing that you can do is to ban things just because you think that they're overpowered. Because again, it's not the DM's job to win. You're trying to just make the game fun for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider. Is my channel's name is No Fun Allowed, and the reason for that is because my players named me No Fun Allowed. They whenever I say yes but or no to something, then they chant No Fun Allowed. And it is important to recognize that this specific person wants the challenge. You got to give them that challenge, because if you have this person at your table and you are going to start banning things, or you're going to say no to everything that they do, then why are they at your table, right? I feel like instead of trying to do 50 workarounds, I think you should just cut right to the point.
Sure. Now, so there's sort of a phrase in improv that gets thrown around a lot, which is yes and. And it's very popular to advocate for trying to always respond positively. When someone says they're going to do something, you're like, all right, and then this happens as a result of that. Now, I always advocate for letting players attempt to do whatever they want to try to do. A lesser cousin of yes and that doesn't get as much attention is no but. Make concessions. If you have to tell someone no, they can't do that, make some kind of concession. Tell them, like, that won't work in that particular way, but you might be able to make it work with something else. Give them an option. Try to make concessions, because it is supposed to be a game where everyone's having fun. And nothing like makes me cringe more than seeing a GM who's chosen to like ban certain things out of the player's handbook, like classes or abilities or feats or whatever, just because they think they're too strong. Because that, to me, doesn't speak to an enlightened GM who has found the imbalances in the system and sought to correct them. That's just someone who doesn't know how to adapt to a challenging situation.
Yeah, I mean, the player characters can always be, hit. Of course, we're talking about the polearm, sentinel, darkness, sees through the darkness warlock. All of a sudden, hey, a Grick appears right underneath your feet. It's got tremor sense. You can't hide from it, right? Simple as that. You just gotta think outside the box. You just gotta consult with other people because you're not the only DM alone out there. There's every DM has dealt with something that they don't appreciate, and you gotta just sit there and either one, talk to other DMs, figure out what to do, or two, you do have to have an honest conversation with that player and say, hey, I'm trying to build a game that says the world feels different, or people don't do that regularly. You have to confront them at some point about it.
What you should do is just find those guys from Tomb of Annihilation, the orcs that cast darkness. They can see through darkness. See how they like it.
Yeah, there's in fact in Volo's Guide to Monsters, there is in fact some orcs that can in fact cast darkness and see through darkness. So in that particular case. Of course, we're very focused on this one particular aspect, but there is a couple of very strong builds. And speaking of builds, let's go ahead and take a look at your character. Alrighty, so yeah, looking at your character here, you are a life cleric human. How average?
Yeah, we thought we'd lean into the averageness on this guy a little bit.
Yeah.
So we're a human. We got a classic, generic cleric, lawful good, acolyte. Man of the cloth.
I mean,
got a shield, got a mace, got some chainmail. I didn't pick any spells, but let's just say they're oriented on healing and killing undead.
Pretty much. You can't really go wrong with that. But the thing is, though, as a human, you rolled a decent amount of odds, and a whopping 4 of your stats were odd. So are you going to bump everything up by 1, or are you going to take the feat?
Feat, with a low constitution, I feel like that toughness, especially if you're going to be a frontliner like a cleric, you don't want to be getting slapped around and dying. So the tough feat helped me stay alive while I keep everyone else alive.
Well, con is the best dump stat, so I guess tough kind of like tough is like what? It's bumping your con by 2, right? Sort of ish.
Your HP by 2 per level.
Yeah. So tough is
effectively it's 4 points of constitution effective. Yeah, it's quite good.
Pretty interesting how that works out. But so your character is not falling into that genre of OP characters we were just talking about.
No. I don't think there's a DM in the world that would ban this. Well, maybe Variant Human. Variant Human sometimes gets banned.
Yeah, so feats in particular, feats are incredibly powerful in 5th edition. They certainly define characters immensely. Feats add to your stats. Feats let you do things that you normally would not be able to do. Feats can be very interesting, but as it does clearly state, it is optional. I personally have not ever sat down at a table that disallowed feats, but I know they exist. I've heard of them. And
no, I don't think I ever would. Not unless I was playing with like literal 10-year-olds.
Yeah, to keep it simplistic for sure. But definitely feats, they are interesting because they have a history throughout D&D, specifically, of course, 3rd edition. 3rd edition, when you wanted to read up on feats, you would be reading a novel, looking at all the different feats.
Yes. 3rd edition. 3.5 and Pathfinder have a lot. Yes. There is a lot of moving parts to those systems. And for some people, that's what they love about it. And power to them. I think it's too much. There's a lot more than there needs to be in those systems, in my opinion.
So we've talked about this before, but crunch in our role playing games.
Sure.
We have so many role playing games. The most popular term of them is zines, basically anywhere between 1 to maybe 30-page little magazines that are fully encompassing role-playing games, but typically these zines are very light on the crunch. They're very light on the rules. They're very simplistic, and they leave a lot to interpretation. And then, of course, we have the 3.5s and we have the Pathfinders, which are, you have a 600-page little document there, and it goes into extreme detail on how you grapple someone a certain way, how drowning works, how if you fall in this direction, it does this, etc., right? And I think it's very important to, when you're sitting down, not just consider the fact that 5th edition is the one and only game, because there is, of course, a ton of games. And you need to sit down and truly discuss with your players, what do you want out of the game? Do you want a high-stakes, roaring adventure that's filled with epic roleplay and swashbuckling, whatever else? Then yeah, 5th edition works well for that. But if you want a game that is all about the role play, then maybe you don't care about the fantasy aspect. In which case, maybe you should look at like Call of Cthulhu, or maybe you should look at, I can't even think of how many other systems there are. There's a ton. And,
tons of them.
Huh?
Tons of them.
Yeah.
There's as many role-playing systems as, well, maybe not stars in the sky, but there's a lot.
There's a decent amount, and it is important to consider, what do you want out of the game and what do your players want out of the game, because there's a ton of role-playing games that have baked in what you could possibly want. Do you want a game where your players start off as nobodies and then eventually become lords over land? That's definitely something that older systems have done. Do you want a game where the players have 100 different character creation options? Then yeah, go ahead and pick up the Pathfinder and whatever else. Or if you don't care about that, then pick up specifically one of the role-playing games. And I'm trying to think of one in particular. There's the high school monster prom one. I'm totally blanking on the name off the top of my head. But those games to cater to everybody. They're catered to, not everybody, they cater to somebody. And maybe that fits your bill.
Yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of role-playing games for sure. There's sort of the more simple and open systems, like say GURPS, or Big Eye Small Mouth, which is an anime-based game that I used to play when I was a teenager. There are more hardcore-oriented games, such as Stars Without Number, or God, what was it called? I'm blanking on the name. It's a fantasy RPG that kind of takes some cues from the original D&D, but generally for more your hardcore, or some might uncharitably say grognard crowd.
I do appreciate the grognard crowd, but yeah, like hardcore games like Warhammer Fantasy, right? Warhammer Fantasy's got that grittiness to it. Zweihander and whatever the frick else. Those in particular.
And then there are simple little fun games that are just silly, like your Monster Prom or your Maid RPG.
Maid RPG. That I was just about to mention that, right? There's whatever you want, it is out there. I promise you. If you want a game that deals with being a soldier in World War II, I'm blanking again on the name because there's just so many names here, but that exists. If you want the game where you're playing Call of Cthulhu, but you don't want to set in the 1920s, maybe you want to set in Victorian time, that game exists. And it's important to actually not to just take the first thing in sight, which is for most people 5th edition. It is important to stretch out and see what you like and what you don't like, because that'll truly make you discover. If you reach out to another game, you look at it, you can sit there and say, okay, I don't like this other system. That means I appreciate the system that I'm using more. Or it could be something along the lines of, you look at another system and say, there's some things I like about that I totally love, but the system itself I'm not really going to use. So maybe I'll go ahead and import some of that to the game that I'm running. 5th edition is really great in that regard, that you can go away and hack at a lot of it and put in your own stuff. Mind you shouldn't do too much before you decide to just play another game, but there's certainly that modularity to it that you should totally do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Role playing isn't just Dungeons and Dragons. There's so much more that you can branch out and do. Now, I myself tend to be a little bit of a D&D purist, but mainly because I really enjoy the mechanical aspects and crunching the numbers and trying to power game out an interesting character. I I love role playing, uh, but I'm kind of a power gamer at heart, and it took me a long time to reconcile that role play uh, part of me and that power gamer part of me. Mostly, what I end up doing now is if I'm creating a character for a game rather than DMing, is I'll come up with an interesting concept for a character that I want to play, and then optimize my character sheet within the constraints of still being that character that I want to play. And I've definitely had some mixed results with that. I've ended up with concepts that were just too useless to make anything out of, and I've ended up with concepts that were so broad that I could just roll up a textbook, whatever I want. But it's fun, and I'm glad that we've got Baldur's Gate 3 coming, uh, you know, in active development, because that's a great outlet for being able to just make those builds and then actually like test them in a place where I'm not you know ruining anyone else's day with my power game.
Yeah, for sure. Those. I really hope. I'm really hoping that the DM system for Baldur's Gate is good, because they tried making a DM system for Divinity Sin, but
Yeah, it wasn't very good.
it wasn't good. Same studio, of course, and same engine, and same this and same that. So I'm not holding my breath that they're going to improve upon the system that much. But the fact that they are now actively working alongside Dungeons or Wizards of the Coast, I'm really hoping that they do step it up. I think because because the system is so great.
Yeah,
You
and I've poked around in the early access. Like it's definitely an enjoyable experience. Like it's a good game.
Oh, for
Um,
sure. The
It'll only get better from here, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. They made a ton of money off of it. They're releasing patches every other week or every month or so. So they're definitely working hard on it. And you can see the finished product with Divinity Original Sin 2 and 1 and 2. Like they tried knocking out of the park, and those games won Games of the Year, and they are now regarded as the pinnacle of that genre of RPG. And something I wanted to talk about a little bit here is one reason why I would love to run a game through Baldur's Gate is because of combat. So
Yeah.
combat in any role-playing game takes X amount of time. Some
Yeah.
games do it far quickly. However, in 5th edition, I typically find that a air quote good combat can take anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour, or
It's
potentially
pretty
even more.
clunky, yeah, for sure.
And unfortunately, once again, system to system, every single game is different. You take a look at some OSR games, and combat can go in like 10 minutes or so, right? But hmm?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, fifth edition kind of took some of the best aspects of the more tactically oriented combat systems in fourth edition, which, oh boy, fourth edition was not well received.
No,
Uh,
no,
I think it was
unfortunately
an
not.
excellent game. I don't think it was a very good role playing game. Um,
Oh,
I would
yeah.
I would have loved to see a fourth edition D&D video game in the style of something like a strategy RPG using fourth edition mechanics. It would have been an amazing game because it had very in-depth systems for tactical combat. And fifth edition took some of the best aspects of that and brought that over. Maybe the only good parts of fourth edition, depending on who you ask. And I think that's great, but it does mean that because they've brought these systems over from a game that was like 100% combat focused, um, having a huge combat session in fourth edition wasn't a big deal because that was the point of fourth edition. But in fifth edition, having a huge combat session like that can detract from the experience somewhat.
Yeah, and you just sit there and the best example of this in regards of doing it with other people is the game Neverwinter Nights. So Neverwinter Nights is still up and running to this day. In fact, I played in a campaign of it semi recently. Yep. And it's amazing how you could sit there and you could theoretically have a game of 5th edition and then a game of, Neverwinter. It could be the exact same scenario, exact same characters, not exactly because Neverwinter is using 3rd edition, but close enough. And you just sit there and the roleplay is the same because, typically the system doesn't dictate the roleplay. So the roleplay is the same, the exploration's the same, but the combat's so nice in Neverwinter because instead of sitting there, waiting for them to take 5 minutes to say their spell and roll their dice, it just goes along. And it just runs so smoothly. And every once in a while you can, ask the DM to pause. But, other than that, your character's swinging along there, spells are going off. You're not sitting there rolling dice actively. The dice are being rolled for you as long as you click, whatever action that you're doing. And simple as that. And so Baldur's Gate is not that streamlined, but Baldur's Gate is, in fact, way more streamlined than, of course, a live game can ever be. So it would be...
It gives you all those calculations up front, right? So you know what your odds are going in. You don't have to, puzzle it out.
And honestly, one of the best things about it is specifically on the DM side of things. When you're a DM, you do have to sit there and house rule some stuff. You do have to sit there and look up some rules occasionally. And instead of having to do that, the game does it for you.
You can do it. You can do it. That's it.
You can do it. You shove the goblin off the cliff. You don't have to sit there and measure it out. You don't have to sit there and roll dice.
Majestically into the sky.
Yeah,
never to return.
It's fantastic, and so that takes a lot of the burden off of the DM. Mind you, if the system comes out, the real burden on the DM would be generating the maps, of course. But
yes,
that would certainly be its own ordeal. But definitely not having to worry about a lot of the mechanical side of things, just having it all right there for the players in particular. That would be absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah. Just depends on what kind of tools there are, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of, I guess this game-to-game system here, you participated, of course, in that West Marches style of game we alluded to.
Yep, the Frontier.
The Frontier.
Now, I know that we talked a lot about it when before the Frontier was even a thing. I remember we had a lot of conversations about dealing with large groups of players and how you accommodated for them. Particularly if you have, say, a Discord server of 50 people and all of them want to play a game, what do you do? And I remember we talked about it, and we even had a few trial runs.
Yes.
Where we talked about a system where people could just kind of drop in and drop out. I remember our prototypical version of it was a band of mercenaries where there would be like a quest board, and then people could just pick up whichever ones interested them, and you would run different sessions that way. And I guess later that kind of evolved into the Frontier, which was a type of pickup game where you had a persistent scenario with a large group of players who would simply run these ad hoc sessions where the things that they did would have a persistent effect on the world at large and the gameplay, without necessarily requiring the same group to always be participating at the same time.
Yeah, that was it was. I picked this up, of course, because I had heard about Wes March's style of gaming, and it blew my mind because apparently that was a norm. It was perfectly normal for if if the D&D group was 20 people, that players would just pick up their character sheet and show up to another person's session all the time. That was the standard so long ago. And that, of course, has been lost to us. We focus more on individual stories. We focus more on individual campaigns. So that typically doesn't happen. But I was enamored with this idea, so I went ahead and did it. And something important to note is, while, yes, you did play in it, as we alluded to earlier, we also alluded to something else. While, yes, you played in it, you also took a sort of mantle in amongst the throngs, and in amongst the peons. You stood above the rest.
Yeah, a little bit of a controversial one.
Yes. So, I took a seat back in regards of player agency. I let them do whatever the frick they wanted. And so one of the things that the group decided was, hey, we need to start up our own guild. We needed, because before it was just a bunch of people going out into the wilderness, exploring, doing whatever. But then it quickly became apparent, how do we handle loot? How do we handle gold? How do we handle arming new adventurers? How do we handle this, and that? So the players in amongst themselves decided that they needed a guild. So they got to work doing that. But of course, when you have many, many people coming together trying to decide how to structure a system, unfortunately, you get a lot of conflicting peoples, you get a lot of arguments, you get a lot of heated discussions, and over the course of days and days of this, eventually it came to a head that, hey, we need someone in charge of this. And once again, I took a complete step back from this. I said, hey, if it comes down to it, maybe I will have to do it, but let's go ahead and see what happens.
Yeah.
But eventually, of course, you got elected.
Yeah, they elected me as their arbitrator, the person who would handle how things go. And I should say, right, up front, I hadn't been participating in a while, right? I hadn't had the free time to keep participating in sessions. So it had been a while. My character had been kind of just sitting on the shelf. So I wasn't at the time an active participant in the game. And I just I joined the call because I saw there were a lot of people talking. I wondered what it was about. So I came in with no context of anything that was happening. Right, I literally came in and said, "Hey guys, what are we talking about?" And then someone said, "I nominate Techno." I didn't know it was being nominated. But they asked me to kind of describe, well, how would you run it, right? If you were going to do this, and I was like, okay, well, as a third party at this point, my character was way behind everyone else's. I had very little stake in this, so I was like, well, I would do it this way, right? I came up with in hindsight, a rather high maintenance method of keeping track of people's contributions in order to kind of distribute items in an equitable fashion. That way people would be able to save their contributions for the things that they actually wanted, rather than being limited to the things that they were actually present for finding. But there were definitely some issues, particularly it took a lot of that striking gold feeling, right? Going out and then getting lucky and finding like the big haul was no longer a thing, because if you were there for the big haul, then yes, you got a portion of the contribution of that big haul, but you didn't just go out, find a dragon's hoard and go, sweet, now I have a dragon. Um, so I mean, I thought it was pretty good, and I presented that system and offered to maintain it myself, because I knew that it was going to take a bit of work. And I mean, they were like, sounds good to us, and they agreed. And then some very loud people weren't too fond of it.
Well, so I remember one of the loud people in particular. The example being, in this world, in the frontier, there were many dungeons. However, while many people treaded toes into these dungeons, very few people actually made it to the finish line. And
yeah, that was actually a really serious problem. Is you could go and kill every single monster in a dungeon except for like the final boss, and then leave. And then someone else could go kill the final boss and go, okay, I got the loot, and you don't get any credits for that contribution. That was I'm willing to admit, right? That was a major flaw
yeah,
in the system. And we never came up with a good solution to it. Like it dissolved before we had a chance to.
The problem is it is a lot of bookkeeping, right? Like
Yes.
I think the air quote fairest solution is to say how many people, you have to track how many times people went to the dungeon, and then you have to track, okay, like, so player A went 3 times, player B went 4 times, player C went only once, and then they were the one that completed it, right? Like, you'd have to do it something like that, but that's not fair because people experience different challenges. The dungeons were usually, how they operated was, the deeper you went, the harder it got. So obviously the people that did clear it in the finish line usually got the worst of it. Here's looking to you, Black Dragon Fight. And, those people that suffered so long, the loud person in particular, that I remember that person went on the majority of the expeditions to that dungeon, and then he just so happened to miss the grand finale.
I mean, even worse, right? They were participating in the session where the loot got recovered.
Mm-hmm.
They were there, but they left halfway.
Yeah.
And so that was a big. I mean, there's a bit of drama involved in that, but it was definitely a difficult thing to come up with. I think that the system that we had was, for the most part, pretty good. I think that people were mostly satisfied with it. It didn't run for very long, and also how we established the loot that was already present was could have probably been handled a little bit better. But I mean, it was an interesting system. One thing that was funny is the people who had the most the most credits, the people who had the biggest contributions, didn't do anything. They didn't actually take out any items. They just held on to it. They hoarded their wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of funny to me that happened, because people pointed to them as examples, and they were like, "Well, obviously they don't, like, they're not using their contributions, so all of that, that credit that they're holding on to is essentially equipment that nobody is getting." And that was a good point, but it was kind of their prerogative to do that, right? Like they had the option of using that equipment, just chose not to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, once again, here's looking to you, Rod of the Pack Keeper. That thing was unobtainable. Unobtainable.
But either of the people with the most money could have theoretically taken it out and like lent it to somebody.
They could have.
Um, I think how I established temporary borrowing of items probably could have been done a little bit better. Um, but I mean, it was something that I came up with like on the fly without any context over the course of an afternoon. It's
Yeah.
not going to be a perfect economic system.
Yeah, like the thing about the Frontier is, 82 sessions, 30 some odd players, all those great experiences and stories and all that stuff. It at the end of the day, it wasn't a full campaign. It was more along the lines of a social experiment.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I did it, It certainly made me realize certain things about DMing. It made me realize things about when I run the next open game. It made me realize certain actions I need to take. And unfortunately, one of those actions is I can't allow for there to be that much freedom again in regards of the air quote guild system. It's not going to be a single player driven, halfway through kind of thing. It'll have a lot more rules upon it, but that's just something you learn. I think that's the whole thing about DMing is you're gonna suck, but you're gonna get better at it, and that's okay.
Yeah, of course. It's a style of campaign that I would enjoy revisiting again, either as a DM or a player. Um, because it's a lot of fun to be able to just drop in and play a game without the pressure of oh I have to you know I have to participate every week or every twice a week or every Wednesday at 6 o'clock, right? You could just be like, oh, there's a session happening then. Yeah, I'm free then. I'll drop in. I'll play a game.
Yeah.
And that was nice. That was it's very rare to be able to play D&D in that way.
And yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we're taking a little break from the Frontier. Well, not a little break. Frontier's done, but the next game that I do run, I do in fact plan on having those systems in place where there's going to be, you just show up to play on certain different days, and that's cool. I know for a fact I'm gonna have other DMs. It's not gonna just be me DMing. However many dozens of people that show up, I'm gonna have multiple DMs. So that way, either games can run more smoothly throughout the week, or maybe even multiple sessions can happen at the same time. Just having multiple DMs will help out quite a lot. And I know for a fact I'm gonna get some people like you that maybe are even willing to do some sort of not DMing stuff, but some fun like player interactivity with the world in that regard. I know.
I mean, I would probably be down for co-GMing. Although these days I've started writing, but I haven't started publishing yet. But yeah, I'm pretty much going to be going the amateur self-published author route.
Hell yeah, I'm writing too.
That's a lot of time.
Writing does take time.
Doing writing
takes a lot of time. You don't think about it, but writing words does suck. Like I in fact this November I just took part in this challenge where I wrote 300 words a day, and then I realized I was like, man, 300 words a day, like that isn't that much, but it actually is. It's a decent amount considering if you're already like writing other stuff as well.
For the last about a month and a half ish, something like that. I have been doing a minimum of 1,500 a day, which I mean, I could probably do more, but it's a lot. It definitely is not easy.
Yeah, like, and it's not like just a stat thing of just it's hard. The more you do, the harder it gets.
Absolutely, yeah. That was one thing I noticed is that like I could do say 1,000 words in like an hour or two easily, but going from 1,000 to 1,500 like doubles the amount of time it takes to write it all out.
Absolutely. It's weird how that works, but that's just the way it is. It's tough because your brain can only produce so many, good juices that day. You can only put down so much. You can only keep up with whatever you're trying to put down, and that's tough.
It does vary, right? Like 1,500 is my minimum. But I'll definitely have days where I just I go into a fugue, and by the time I come out of it, I've written 4,500 words. I'm just like, oh my god, what happened? But yeah, it's been a lot of it's been interesting. I'm a little bit nervous about the actual publishing part of it because obviously to make a Patreon and Discord and all that stuff. Never done it before, but it's an adventure, and I'm looking forward to it.
Hell yeah. And I look forward to seeing that as well because I'll definitely buy whatever you put down. That is, man, that was already 2 hours. Golly. Yeah, I think that is gonna do it. That time flew by. So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was an absolute blast. Yeah, go ahead and sell yourself if you've got anything selling right this second.
You would, but I started it. Well, maybe another time.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, another conversation.
Next time. Alrighty, yeah, that is going to do it for this episode of the Roll for Stats podcast. One last little look at your character sheet. You are a poor, sad human.
Guy. I'm a dude.
You're just a dude. I got
a shield. I should have spells. Pretend I have spells.
Yeah, you got cleric spells. I
can cure wounds. I can radiant fire. I forget what's cantrip.
Sacred Flammy.
Sacred flame. There you go.
Sacred Flammy. Yeah, absolutely.
I can do that. I can.
Yeah,
I can heal things. Not for
you can.
It was really low.
Yeah. So this is our most mundane character yet. I know for a fact at one point we are going to be taking these characters out for a test drive on some adventure, and it'll be hilarious seeing these characters because if you take a look through them, we have characters that are incredibly, weighty in one area. The last two characters have 18s in strength, but they are lacking in other degrees.
Well, I think we had to know that 2d9 was going to be average, right? Because we talked about it. We talked about it before the stream, and we were like, "What's the average on 2d9?" It's 10. We're like, "Oh, that's very average."
But the floor was so low. Where was the 2?
Yeah, it just never happened.
It just never happened.
You get an 18 either.
No 18, no 2. Alrighty, that is going to do it for this one. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you all to my lovely patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. You keep this show running. And
you should name it all 10 of them. Wait, you can't lump them.
All 10 of them. But hey, you guys are incredible. Thank you so very much. That is going to do it for me, and I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.
Well, thank you for having me on.